they took a gamble on saying, could you change the economics? Could you move people from the countryside to the city? Could you do all these huge kind of transformations and stay the same?
Hello, what a fabulous sight. Welcome to Edinburgh International Book Festival. My name is Keelan Hughes, and I'm thrilled to be here on the first day of what's bound to be an iconic festival. We're here to discuss this mammoth, inimitable, wonderful book, Fintan O'Toole's We Don't Know Ourselves, A Personal History of Ireland Since 1958. And we'll talk about that in a moment. I'll introduce the book in a moment. I want to thank the Scottish Mortgage Investment Trust for sponsoring this event. On the sponsorship note, we're streaming online, so if you're watching this at home, it's a pay-what-you-can program, so do consider paying for your ticket or making a donation to Edinburgh International Book Festival so they can continue to do this amazing work and bringing everyone into rooms like this together. In a final bit of housekeeping, if you haven't turned off your phones or put them on airplane mode, now is the time to do it. I expect it would take quite a lot to throw Fenton off his game, but let's not try. If you're tweeting about the event, just try and be discreet. The final 15 minutes will be a Q&A, and it's going to be a mixture of questions that are coming from online, which I'll read from the tablet, and questions from the audience here. So keep that in your mind and try to plug any inevitable gaps in my questioning. And there'll be a signing after the event in the signing tent. So it's my honor to interview an author whose work I have read and admired since before I knew that newspapers weren't written by just one person. I did a course on theatre criticism at Queen's University and read Fintan's reviews and thought, what's this political reporter doing writing about two men trying to get into a disco in Tuam? I took from that theatre productions are just as fit and worthy a subject of analysis and critique as elections. That culture and politics and economics can't be kept apart is inevitable, try as we might. Thanks once again to Scottish Mortgage Investment Trust for sponsoring this event. I'm sure there's a master's thesis in who the sponsors were for Fintan's previous books, Ship of Fools, How Stupidity and Corruption Sank the Celtic Tiger, or Enough is Enough, How to Build a New Republic. Just because it makes us squirm doesn't mean it's more comfortable to ignore. This may come up again in our conversation. For those who don't know Fintan's work, I doubt there's anyone in the room. I won't do a show of hands. He's a scarily prolific critic, journalist, social historian, public intellectual, political science scholar, the recipient of an Orwell Prize for Journalism and the European Press Prize for Commentary. He writes for the Irish Times, The Guardian, the New York Times, the New York Review of Books. He's authored some 25 books, from Heroic Failure, Brexit and the Politics of Pain, to Shakespeare is Hard, but So is Life. He teaches at Princeton. The book in question, We Don't Know Ourselves, A Personal History of Ireland Since 1958, published by Head of Zeus. It traces 60 years of globalization and cultural upheavals in Ireland, touching on sectarian violence, on institutional violence, corruption, and collusion, the best Christian in the village obedience that was carefully cultivated by the Irish political establishment in collaboration with the church. That's taken generations of grassroots activism to undermine. In The Independent, David Lynch wrote of this book, yes, I know all that boring stuff about the liberal hegemony, about newspaper columnists preaching progressive sermons like the missioners of old. But really, if we must have a hegemony, the best, by a long way, is the liberal kind. And to know how it happened, here is the Bible. Personally, I don't like the Bible analogy. It seems more coming of age than quest narrative. It begins with the year of your birth, 1958, and you were born into a shameful, impoverished Ireland where people were raising children knowing that those children were going to leave. I think the stat given is that 3 in 5 would leave. who were born in that year. So at the same time as that shameful, kind of difficult economic context, there were seeds of change being planted. And one of those seeds was a publication from a civil servant called T.K. Whitaker. It was a study of the Irish economy called Economic Development, Programme for Economic Expansion. Fairly dull title, but it did change the country completely, or at least it was one of the elements that caused that change. Another of those seeds was the Minister for Industry and Commerce, Sean Lemass, travelling to Paris to explore joining the nascent European Economic Community, or the European Free Trade Association. Another of the seeds, so just bearing these little pointers, these events in mind, this is very much how their book is written. The whim of an archbishop rendered Dublin Theatre Festival cancelled in what's possibly the original moment of cancel culture. This happened in the year of Fenton's birth. And I wondered whether it was the whiplash of this need to change and the need to stay the same that was the impetus for the book.
Thank you so much well, thank you all so much for being here. It's such a delight to be back in physical communion with each other again, isn't it? And such an honor to do this with Keelan, whose work I've admired so profoundly for a long time. Yeah, you know, what was going on in '58 when I was born was really, as you said, this, because it was also in that year that one of my favorite novels was published, which is Giuseppe de Lampedusa's *The Leopard*. I don't know if you know that wonderful Italian novel, which has that famous line where, you know, the young guy's going off to join the revolutionaries, and his uncle, who's the Duke, is disgusted, and he says, you know, how can you do this? You're betraying us. And he says, no, what you don't understand is that in order for things to stay the same, things must change, you know. And that was very much what was happening in Ireland in the year of my birth, which was this official realization that, in a way, the game was up. So Ireland had become independent 100 years ago this year, 1922. It had been partitioned, which meant that the most developed, industrialized, wealthiest part of the country was in the north. That was separated from the south, which left the south really as this kind of rural, overwhelmingly Catholic, and quite underdeveloped country, which then tried to do, I suppose, what nationalists were trying to do in the 1930s, you know, which was to put up high tariff barriers, keep the country behind them, and hope that it would kind of develop independently. But the problem was that you couldn't keep the people in. 2 countries in Europe lost population in the 1950s. In the 50s was the great era, of course, of population rebounding after the horrors of the Holocaust, the Second World War. The repopulating of Europe is going on all over the place. Only 2 countries lost population. One was East Germany, for obvious reasons, and the other was Ireland. And the Irish government couldn't build a wall. You know, so the East German solution was to build a wall. They would have built a wall if they could, actually. I mean, they really would. If it had been practical, that's exactly what they would have done. But they couldn't do that. And so the place was being bled dry of its young people. People were just leaving. They were coming to Britain. They were going to America. They were going to Australia. Because the life they were leading just wasn't, you know, Irish people they'd been globalized in a way for a long time. They'd emigrated. They knew that there were better lives available elsewhere, you know, and they were going to those lives. So you had this project, really, which was very top-down, you know, so it came, as you said, from really one civil servant, senior civil servant, who happened to be young and brilliant, supported by one government minister who was a kind of hero of the 1916 Rising. He'd been in, you know, think about people who'd been in politics at this stage for 40 years, you know, but saying, look, if we don't change, we can't keep things the same. The Catholic nationalist Ireland that we know and love is not viable. And so we have to do something big in order to try to make it viable. And so what they did was really they took a gamble, which in a way is the sort of story of the book, which is they took a gamble on saying, could you change the economics? Could you move people from the countryside to the city? Could you do all these huge kind of transformations and stay the same? You know, could you still have this kind of power structure, which was church and state, you know, being the most Catholic country in the world? I mean, they were, you know, Whittaker, for example, who did this, was a very devout Catholic, you know, and really did believe somehow that you could beat the odds, you know, that, and the fascinating thing really is not that in the end the gamble turned out to be lost. It's now lost, right? you couldn't keep Holy Catholic Ireland with all the change that was going to go on. But it's also how long it took for the gamble to fail, you know, that actually for most of my life sort of looked like they were kind of pulling it off in a weird way. And it's the weirdness, the strangeness, the surreal nature of this, I suppose, is what I was trying to get at in telling the story.
Okay. The title, we don't know ourselves. I don't know whether Scottish readers will get the double meaning of that. But in Ireland, if you say we don't know ourselves, it can be because you've managed to fix the shower pressure and you're just delighted with your new situation. We don't know ourselves. We don't recognize ourselves from the misery we were in. And then the double meaning, the more pertinent one for the negative side of the book, you know, we don't know ourselves, as in we fail to know ourselves or we choose not to know ourselves. On that foreboding side, I mean, to say the double meaning is also to say that the book is very funny. It is actually very funny, even though if you were to list kind of the topics that come up in it, you would run a mile. So one of those on the foreboding side is the Archbishop of Dublin, John Charles McQuaid. I don't know how well known that name is over here, but certainly even as a child I would have known that name and shivers would have run up my spine. And you served for him, you served Mass. So he was a bishop with the power to phone up an MP, to turn up at his residence and to hear his take on a proposed policy. And I grew up hearing these stories of these awful autocrats, and I came to understand, though, that the evil couldn't be centered on just a few men, that the evil was institutionally embedded, and the public, who had to negotiate public institutions, you know, through schools, through hospitals, they were rendered complicit, which is a passive way of saying they were complicit. And so in writing about this clerical abuse, you describe the genius for knowing and not knowing at the same time, the known unknowns. And I wonder if we should be talking about how trauma from a violent state begets willful blindness and collusion from its citizens.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a story that you could tell in a lot of societies. You know, we all know that there's plenty of capacity in different societies to avoid things that we do really know but prefer not to know or pretend we don't know, because if we know them we have to confront them, you know. But I think Irish culture was particularly good at this. You know, I think it was deeply rooted. It was the way the culture operated. You could argue it's one of the ways in which the culture was very creative, actually, because avoidance is quite creative. You know, you get around things, you create other worlds, you find strategies really for avoiding reality, but also very, very dark. You know, it's so. I don't know. I mean, you mentioned this guy John Charles McQuaid. So he was the Archbishop of Dublin when I was born, and as you mentioned, like the Dublin Theatre Festival, which would have been like the equivalent of the Edinburgh Festival, you know, it's the big cultural event, was just cancelled the weekend I was born because there were works in it by James Joyce, or an adaptation from James Joyce, and a new play by Sean O'Casey. I mean, two of the greatest Irish writers of the 20th century, you know. And McQuaid indicated his displeasure. Like, he didn't make a statement or a sermon, or, you know, he just made it known that he was unhappy. And the whole thing was just cancelled, you know. And this was the power, you know. It was a kind of power that was so deeply rooted that it didn't need to express itself really very much, you know. It was just there. And so people had, you know, but they themselves, and the people who, you use the word evil, and I don't think it's wrong. I mean, I tell the story in the book. I served Mass for this guy. I was a good Catholic altar boy, you know, and he came to, I grew up in a kind of working class suburb of Dublin, and he came, and I mean, the only equivalent I can think of would be a medieval town, you know, where the monarch arrives on progress somewhere, you know, because it really was monarchical. And I was serving Mass, and we'd done special training, you know, and it was very exciting, very theatrical. But I was walking up the road that morning, and this huge car, I mean, the biggest car I'd ever seen, was outside the parish priest's house. The parish priest had died. He was a friend of McQuaid's. That's why he was he was saying the Mass. And I was walking up the road, and there was this huge car, which was fascinating. But also then there was this strange sight where there was this man in a uniform who was kneeling on the pavement at the side of the car. And as I got closer, I could see sticking out of the side of the car 2 shoes. And I thought, oh, and he was polishing these shoes. And then as I got closer, I realized the shoes were still attached to the feet of the Archbishop. I mean, it was just astonishing. You know, even as a 7-year-old kid, I mean, it was just, is that what Jesus was about? You know, a man having to kneel on the pavement, shining the shoes of this powerful princeling, you know. But it was also wonderful. I mean, it was also, you know, I've never experienced it in my life, you know, when he came back after the Mass to us, and he was charismatic, and he just oozed kind of majesty and power, you know. And I felt, he talked to us, and he was beautiful brown eyes, and he kind of looked at you, and you felt encompassed in some sort of wonderful way. And what I didn't know then was that he knew, so not very long before that, he had, the Scotland Yard had got on to the police in Ireland to say that the chaplain of the Children's Hospital, which was just down the road from our church, had sent photographs, or sent a roll of film to be developed in London of naked pictures of children in the hospital, of their genitalia, frankly. And you know, what happened then was the Scotland Yard got onto the commissioner of the police in Dublin, who got onto the Archbishop. Right? Didn't say, let's go and arrest this guy and get him out of this position where he's a danger to children. No, let's talk to the Archbishop to avoid any problem for the church. And the film was handed over to the Archbishop, who basically let this guy continue. I mean, just decided that no, it was not worth it for the church to have any possibility of scandal. And then, of course, continually doing this kind of stuff. So it's this is the doubleness which I think does become a kind of evil, you know, which was that they could maintain a sense of absolute sanctity and spiritual power, while at the same time being extraordinarily cynical about the use of that power, and really not caring about kids like me, you know, who are the ones who were, you know, in danger from precisely the people that he had placed there and kept there.
Yeah, and violating the very reason for entering their profession in the way, you know, of just teaching basic humanity. Yeah. Yeah. There's so much to discuss with this book. Any one subject, I could speak with Fenton for hours at length on this. I really recommend you read it yourselves. So I'm sorry that there's going to be a little bit of jumping, but so chronologically moving on, say, from that period of your youth, I guess that would have been in the 60s that you were embroiled with McQuaid. But a little later on, or perhaps very early in that century, or in that decade, there was another stepping stone of change, which was a sort of stone through the window from sectarian violence beginning to really ramp up in Ireland. So one of the events that coincided with Fintan's birth was the masked members of the IRA raiding a British camp in Dorset. And then, very close to home indeed, in 1972, there was a scare in your own family. Fintan's dad was a bus driver, and there was a car bomb planted near CIE, which is the bus headquarters, the depot, which killed 2 bus conductors. And there was a second bomb also that caused major damage to Liberty Hall. So I guess you would have been 14, that same year. In the book, you mentioned shouting up the IRA at Jack Lynch in Croke Park. So the book is excoriating when it comes to sectarian violence, particularly when it comes to the IRA. And I suspect this has something to do with the timing of the book's publication and the fact that you have a big American readership, that maybe there's certain things that need to be heard. This is why we need hours, because this doesn't come up in the book, so I can't really question you about it. But nonetheless, I wonder how that proximity of violence to yourself and your own household altered your sense of Ireland's future then, through the Troubles, and then as a young journalist, on the positive side, how surreal it must have been to be covering the 1998 Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah. You know, as you say, we could talk about the Troubles for a long, long time, but the aspect of it that maybe is kind of interesting is, from my point of view, is, again, it was this strange doubleness. Right? So we grew up as sort of ordinary Catholic kids with nationalism, you know, as it was as much in the water as Catholicism was. You know, it was, and they were fused together as this was your identity. This is who you were. And a big part of this was martyrdom. You know, the idea, like we were told as kids, that the highest aspiration, you know, well, one was to be the Archbishop and the other was to be a martyr for Ireland, you know. And they were kind of like the same thing. There were two aspects of the same sort of holiness. But by 1966, which was the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, which, you know, it all seemed just like a story. You know, it was in songs, and there were big kind of documentary films in '66 on the state TV, and it was all fantastic. But it was oddly unreal, you know. And so it was. You could kind of indulge in this sort of stuff without it having any consequence. The IRA had become a joke, and in the Republic, and actually largely in Northern Ireland as well. I mean, if you talk to people even from kind of very Republican families, they'll tell you that some of them didn't even know that their father, for example, had been imprisoned because he wouldn't talk about it. You know, imprisoned in the 1940s, because it was a thing that was. It seemed like it was over, and then suddenly it wasn't over. And and then what happens is that the story, you know, the story of martyrdom and dying for Ireland, which of course also implies killing for Ireland, becomes real. It's happening. And this, again, this kind of cognitive dissonance, you know, that's what's supposed to happen, isn't it? And then I was telling the story, as you say, but I was sort of all in favor. I thought it was a wonderful thing that, you know, the IRA was killing people, and it was great. And then suddenly, as you say, there was this incident, there was a bomb in Dublin. It came really close, and it was outside the canteen for the bus workers, and this is before mobile phones, you know, so you just hear this, and my dad was out. There's no way of contacting him. You know, we didn't have a phone in the house. And that sort of hours of sitting there waiting, you know, was he going to come home or not? And hearing that two bus conductors had been killed and others had been, you know, and I sort of remember the sound of the key in the door, you know, just that, and the sense of relief. But it changed you, because then you thought, oh, you know, this is human. This is not a big story about martyrdom and violence. You know, it's a story about what happens to real people. And so this kind of strange disjunction, really, I think, is where there's that great line in what I think is the greatest Irish play, you know, Playboy of the Western World, Sings play, but which is so prescient about all this, isn't it? You know, because the story is the guy who comes and gives the great story about how he's killed his father, and everyone thinks he's great. And then the father's not really dead. He comes in and he attacks the father and tries to kill him. And then they think he's a murderer. You know, it's horrible. How dare you do this? And the great line, you know, is Peggy and Mike, who's in love with him, says, but there's a great gap between a gallous story and a dirty deed. And we existed for quite a few years in that gap between the sort of lovely, brave story that we had internalized and the dirty deeds that were happening, you know. And again, I think that's also where this idea of unknowing or not knowing. And I think what a lot of the Republic did, the south of Ireland did, was decided in a way not to know. I mean, decided to withdraw from what was going on in Northern Ireland. And you may say that's very disreputable thing to do when it's so close and so intimate. But it was almost as if people had no other way of dealing with it other than to, as it were, kind of pretend it wasn't happening and hope it stays up there, it stays away from us. So yeah, I think we also lived through that. And then, I think that was important because there was this realization that something else had to be done, and that this gradual emergence in the 1990s of possibility. And what was the possibility? The possibility was that actually all this doubleness and doublethink could be made positive. So rather than doublethink being the negative thing that it was, there was a version of doublethink which is actually about accepting doubleness, accepting that our identity and belonging had different aspects and different meanings. And that wonderful phrase, in the Belfast Agreement, which I still adore, it's a great bit of drafting. It says, and maybe it's the key in the Belfast Agreement, it says it is the birthright of everyone in Northern Ireland to be Irish or British or both, as they may so choose. And that or both, that sort of getting to a point where you can accept that your identity is multiple and chosen, and that you could choose otherwise. That's the great genius of the Belfast Agreement, actually, I think, and also why some of us get so angry when we see it being screwed with by Brexit, frankly. So.
Yeah, absolutely. There was one other type of everything sits under this doubleness in a way, but I wanted to bring up in Scotland. I know because it's an issue here as well. I believe you were the first in your family to go to college. Is that right? And I often think of access to education as having to do with class, because class has to do with access. And your book dispels the notion that Ireland was ever classless, which is something that sometimes comes up, especially from English interviewers. There's really an anger steaming off the page in the chapter on the Dunn crime family and the early 80s heroin epidemic in Dublin under Gareth Fitzgerald's government. So it was a social disaster that decimated many lives in the inner city. I found a really powerful section of the book, especially in light of the current drug crisis in Ireland. Can you, I guess, describe that capacity, perverse capacity for compartmentalization?
Yeah. The strange thing about these stories often is that they contain lots of different other narratives that kind of come together. And so one of the things I try to do in the book is to tell you a story about my own family or the place I grew up in, and then kind of open it up. And so this chapter starts with two young boys wandering around London, and one of them being stopped by a policeman, and who are you, and are you lost? And then they discover that these two kids have been hiding in a basement in London, and these were kids. They lived just around the corner from where I grew up. And they were called the Dunn brothers, or there were two of the Dunn brothers. And they had basically fled. And there was a real worry about they were missing, so nobody knew where they were, and their mother was around the place, and everybody was going, the poor mother. And it turned out that they'd basically fled, and they were kids of great resourcefulness. They'd somehow managed to blag their way over to London, and they were living off scraps, and they were really clever little boys. And they were sent off to what were called industrial schools. And the industrial schools were part of this hellishness, and again, also part of this knowing, not knowing. So Ireland had, in order to be the most Catholic country in the world or in the universe, you had to have vicious repression, right? You had to actually terrify the people who were out of line or didn't fit. So you had this archipelago of repressive institutions. You probably heard the Magdalen laundries, where young girls who were in moral danger or posing a moral danger to others were locked up and enslaved. I mean, I use the word advisedly. They were enslaved. They were forced labor in these laundries, not paid. with no legal process often. You had the mother and baby homes, which we're really still kind of grappling with, where young women who were pregnant out of wedlock were secreted away, given code names, numbers, and their babies taken off them then when the baby was born to be adopted and sent elsewhere. But then you had these industrial schools, which is where kids were sent. And they were hellholes, absolute hellholes. Everybody knew about them. Everybody knew. I don't remember not knowing two words. So as long as I have memory of language, I remember letter frack and dangan. And these were the places where two of the most notorious industrial schools were. Because you're always told, if you don't behave yourself, you're going to letter frack, or you're going to, so we're meant to be hellish. And so what happened to these Dunn boys was they were sent into this industrial school system. And then they emerged from that horror, 15 years later, and they were sort of around the place. They were kind of selling dope, And then suddenly kids who went to buy dope were saying, we've got this new thing, which we'll give you a free sample of, which was heroin. I mean, nobody knew what heroin was. I mean, the innocence, the sort of vulnerability that was there. And of course, a lot of Western Europe was being flooded with heroin because as a result of the Afghanistan wars and the Iranian Revolution, all that stuff was going on. So, and they were marketing it. I mean, they actually they gave samples away free. And then this became very quickly like wildfire. And I think something similar happened in Edinburgh, parts of Glasgow. But, like wildfire, just you had this epidemic of heroin. But what was terrible about it was both that it was these kids, doing it, and there was an element of sort of revenge on society, and there was also then this, as you say, Keelan, the government saying, we don't know about this. It's not happening. Again, it's an extraordinary ability to say, well, because it was happening to working class people, literally nothing was done. It was just heroin is something that happens in America. It doesn't happen here. And so it was allowed to take root. It's still a huge problem in Dublin. It's never gone away. And that was really when you started to get this bitterness, I think, this very obvious sense for a lot of these working class communities that the state literally didn't care about them. It just did not care what was happening to them. And of course, it was only when the drug problem started to, get into middle class areas that it became an issue. So it was a very dark example, really, of that ability of the state to just completely ignore the reality that was having such an effect on the lives of so many young people.
And you think they just didn't know how to deal with it, so they just chose not to?
They didn't want to know, and then they didn't. When they started thinking about it, they really didn't know what to do about it. They commissioned a report from an English guy who came and talked to people about it, and he said, "Really, I don't know what you're going to do, but maybe the church might be the only people who could deal with it." So it was this idea of the society that, the church is where our refuse goes, So maybe the church could build more like industrial schools and bring all these kids into them, and wouldn't that be a way of getting it off the streets or something? That was the only kind of imagined solution. And the church didn't want to know, because the church was smart enough to realize that wasn't going to work even if they tried it,
Yeah. Imagine the progress we could have had.
Yeah.
So the 90s was a period of wrecking balls and of laying foundations, very literally. I was 5 when Mary Robinson became president, and you can bet that informed my young girlhood, my view of women in the world, especially with Mary McAleese. I thought you had to be called Mary and you had to have a 5-syllable name.
Yeah.
That's all, But in the years following then, there were other kind of elements of the wrecking ball in the 90s. So Bishop Eamon Casey fled Ireland for the US. The tribunal on the corrupt former Taoiseach Charles Haughey got underway. A documentary series produced by Mary Rafferty on the industrial schools that you mentioned already was aired. It took another decade for Mary Rafferty's findings in that series to be kind of validated. and recognised, and there was an official report into sexual abuse in the Dublin Archdiocese then. Cut to 2015, looking at the time, and Ireland voted in favour of gay marriage by referendum. 2018, there was a ban on abortion that was lifted by referendum, thanks to astonishing campaigns that outshone the international evangelical coins poured into the No campaign. Charlie Haughey told a magazine called Hot Press in 1984 that he was not at all worried about a youth revolt. "I wouldn't be all that worried about an explosion," he said. "You see, if you go back to 1968, all the campuses in America were exploding, and you had the French situation. Well, that's all suddenly changed. There's a big reversal now among young people. They've become a lot more cautious, not conservative, but much more committed to trying to find their own way in life than trying to change society." What do you make of the youth today when it comes to revolt on the island of Ireland as distinct from US campuses?
Well, you know, what really changed in Ireland were, you know, to me, like the great sort of turning point actually was when a group of young feminists went on the train from Dublin to Belfast to buy contraceptives. And they did this as a public demonstration. Contraceptives were banned in Ireland, of course, you know, under the church, as was divorce. Abortion was life imprisonment. And so in 1970, this group of feminists went, you know, they just, you know, did it as a public demonstration, really. And they went up to buy contraceptives in Belfast with the idea that they would bring them back and they would challenge the customs authorities who were at the railway station to take the contraceptives off them or to arrest them. And it was a fabulous event. I mean, you know, I was a teenage boy, and it was the first time sex, you know, like the sort of notion, contraceptives, were they to do with sex? Yeah, they were, you know. And these fabulous women did this, and it was really brave and funny. It was also utterly surreal because it happened that they didn't realize that to get the contraceptives in Belfast, you needed a doctor's prescription to buy the pill, and they didn't have it. So they bought aspirin, and so they pretended that they had, so they were kind of, you know, fake pills, and the customs authorities, so they insisted that these were pills and they should be arrested, and customs authorities pretended not to hear them. You know, so it was a very Irish event, you know, where like actually nothing was really happening, but they produced this spectacle really, which was showing up the absurdities, you know, and increasingly that was what was going on, you know, which was that Irish people were living with absurdity, you know, and this is, you mentioned the book is funny in some ways, and like some of it is funny in a kind of grotesque way because. And this is a roundabout way of answering about, you know, that the real question from, say, 2015, if you look back, is how did it all go so fast? You know, how does this incredible power, which is this fusion of church and state, it has spiritual power, psychological power, political power, economic power, how does it go in, really, it seems to melt away in less than 10 years? And it does so, of course, because it was already so absurd, you know, that everybody knew it. And this is, again, the knowing, not knowing thing, you know, that young people, I mean, my life as a young person in Dublin was not that different from the life of a young person in London or in Edinburgh or in Boston. You know, we did the same sorts of stuff. Except that the state sort of said, no, you know, they're not, this is not happening, right? You know, we will, if you put up a condom machine in the Students' Union, we'll come and take it out, you know, because of course you couldn't be having sex. Or we know you're having sex, but we're never going to bring in a law saying that this is okay to sell contraceptives, because then we would be admitting that we're not the most Catholic country in the world. So this kind of absurdity was going on for a long time. One of my favorite episodes of Irish history is that in the 1970s up to the early 80s, Ireland had the highest rate of menstrual problems in the known world. Some Irish women just could not control their menstrual cycles. What was wrong with them? You know, and this became a kind of subject of international comment. You know, it was, what, you know, and of course, what turned out was that If you knew the right doctor, you could get the pill prescribed as a cycle regulator. It was not to do with the Tour de France. It was, you know, and of course it was the pill for contraceptive purposes. It could not be prescribed for contraceptive purposes. So a way around this, right, was that, well, you know, of course, if you have menstrual problems, you can get the pill. So the list of symptoms, I think I list them, you know, was like, you know, putting on weight, losing weight, you know,
bad skin,
you know, having spots, not having spots. But I mean, any possible thing could be put down to, you know, the irregularity. So this was a way of dealing with the stuff. So I think in a way, you know, you already had lots and lots of people who were leading very complex lives. I mean, in one way, though, you have to hand it to conservatives in Ireland because they were right about one thing. I mean, there was, nonetheless, say in the 1980s in Ireland, there was only one homosexual. And it was a man called David Norris. He was a really brave, heroic man who went on television and said, you know, I'm a homosexual. And he challenged the state. He took the law, the Oscar Wilde laws were still in place. I mean, the laws under which Oscar Wilde was prosecuted were still in place. And David went to the courts, and the courts said, these laws are perfectly right because we're a Christian society and you can't. I mean, it's shocking. I mean, really dreadful judgments. But in a way, the Conservatives were right because there was only one homosexual now, and the place is full of them. Then the place is full of them now. You know, it's like, you know, and they were right that, you know, that because, you know, what they were afraid of was of course they knew that, you know, homosexuality, all sorts of other strange things were going on in the country. But so long as you didn't admit it, there was this idea that somehow it wasn't happening or it wouldn't happen. And from their perspective, they would say, you know, if David Norris hadn't been allowed to go on television, we would have had all this problem, you know. Like, you know. So you had this kind of absurdity, this surrealism, really, of what people knew to be the case and what the official story was. And I think what was the safety valve was always emigration. Safety valve was, how did you deal with all this? Well, people who just found it too absurd or too insulting. Like I have a chapter in the book about a very close friend of mine who was gay, you know, and who was the most Irish person I ever met. He spoke Irish, he taught in Irish, he was a brilliant linguist, he had a great job, he was the official translator in the Parliament, translating from English into Irish. And he just said to me, well, I'm leaving, I'm getting out. And I couldn't understand, you know, why he was leaving. And I said, it's not because you're gay, is it? And he said, yeah, I just can't stand it anymore. I just can't take the fact that I'm a second-class citizen in my own country, that, you know, the law still treats me with contempt. And of course, huge numbers of people like that were leaving all the time. I mean, just, you know, women, gay people, but just a lot of people just couldn't stand the hypocrisy anymore. And really what turns is the economic change in the late 90s when Ireland starts getting rich, or, you know, the Celtic Tiger is happening, people start coming back. And because they start coming back, or they cease to leave, I think that's what you get, this kind of build-up of very highly educated, very smart people who are just not going to stand for it anymore, you know. And I think that's what leads you up to 2015, where Ireland becomes the first country in the world to bring in same-sex marriage by popular vote. You know, it happened elsewhere by parliaments or courts. And 2018, where you get the reversal of the anti-abortion clause in the Constitution by popular vote, both happening by 2-1, both happening by votes in both rural and urban Ireland, both happening with older people as well as younger people, you know, voting in the same way to a very large extent. This transformation was unthinkable to official Ireland, but I think it was really almost like just an acceptance of reality rather than a transformation of the reality.
Right. And I'm aware of time. This is the last question I'm going to ask, and then I'll have a peek and see are there questions here, although I would love to ask you 10,000 questions from what you just said. But on the fear that there is this culture of self-mythologizing, I mean, now contemporary Ireland, we have become extremely good at being morally adaptable, at shimmying around things, at finding our way around things, and we're good at protecting our privilege, or at least we have been. And so those things are, what can lead to success in a neoliberal economy. And so I do want to just ask about the US economic influence, because it's ubiquitous in Ireland, and we have been talking about the economic transformation. A huge amount of that came from US direct investment. So there's so many things I would love to say. I'm just burning up by not knowing that I won't be able to ask them. But so foreign direct investment, there was, in the past 30 years, it's been fueled, that economic change has been fueled primarily from that. So in 2017, US direct investment stock in Ireland totaled 457 billion. That's a greater stock investment than in Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Belgium, Denmark, and Sweden combined. Just to put the shivers on you. Karl Marx warned that if you change the economy, you change the country or culture. Is modern Ireland a case in point? Do you think we're worryingly reluctant to talk about the cost of outsourcing this change and this influence?
Yeah, so the Faustian pact, if you like, really is that, all of this change is underwritten really by, as you say, foreign direct investments, particularly American, right? So Ireland becomes really the American base in the European Union. One of the reasons why Ireland will never leave the European Union, apart from maybe a lot of other more positive ones, is that so much of that investment is dependent on being in the European Union. That's why it's there, and it is extraordinary. Ireland. For example, during the pandemic, the Irish economy grew rapidly. Why? Because it's specialized in three things. One is pharmaceuticals, the other is medical devices, and the other one is IT. They're huge hubs for American investment in those three areas, all of which, of course, benefited enormously from the pandemic. So it's very surreal. You've got this kind of huge economic, technological, scientific infrastructure that kind of landed on top of this place. At one level, it's underwritten all of this kind of social transformation, most of which, to my mind, is for the good. On the other hand, it creates a new version of this doubleness, because you've got two economies, two places. If you go to Dublin now, you'll still see, a lot of poverty, a lot of underdevelopment, and you'll see, the global headquarters, the European headquarters of all. I think of any major American tech company, for example.
Yeah, because to participate in neoliberal economics, as we're doing, you get with that massive inequality. That's part of the equation.
And you get in your, so you're both part of a world, of course, which is massively unequal, but also you get within your own country, you get that same inequality. And not just inequality, but also like two completely different narratives, as to what's growing, what's doing really well. So the house that I grew up in, which was housing for poor people, basically in the 1930s, all those houses are now bought by Google executives or, by people who are working for major multinational companies. So the people who used to live in those houses have nowhere to live. That kind of stuff is going on all the time. And there are strange things, like nobody, for example, like you talk about the unknown knowns, like my phrase for Ireland, nobody knows what Irish GDP is. Nobody can tell you. We get figures, but like one year recently, the Irish GDP grew by 23% in 1 year, which was just to do with some companies like Apple moving stuff around, and so actually figuring out like what is Ireland, what's actually ours, what do we produce, as opposed to all of this kind of mystery of money that floats around this kind of global system. So that definitely does kind of produce its own version of this neurosis. But to be quite honest, it's a version of the neurosis I would rather have than the one that I grew up with.
Okay. Well played. So I'm going to take a question from the audience. This doodle thingy is broken, so someone will come out and probably replace it. But if there may be a roving mic there, yes, there's one on either side. Thank you. So do I see any hands? Oh, yes, brilliant.
Thank you. Fintan, I'm really enjoying the book. But
Thank you.
One problem in reading it is I'm suffering so much gestalt that I'm going, ugh. You know? But the idea of it all being top down, there must have been a receptive layer there for change. And at the same time, I'm presuming that receptive layer consisted the audience for your development of your critical facilities, because you weren't writing or talking to air.
Yeah.
So could you say anything about that, where you felt the change yourself personally, and what areas, not just in theatre, but out with that?
Thank you very much for it's a great question. Yeah, when I said it's top down, I meant the program was, because I think by, in the late 50s when I was born, I think most Irish people who were unhappy emigrated. That they just dealt with it in a kind of despair. It was kind of fatalism, The idea that Ireland was going to change much probably wasn't on the agenda. And so what happened then in the 60s was a lot of people came back, they were delighted. I mean, people really did want this change. Absolutely, they were desperately hungering for it. You look at the great writers of that time, the Ed O'Brien and Tom Murphy and Brian Friel and so on and so on, and you pick up this anger, this hunger, very, very definitely there, and so, I mean, when I started writing in the 80s, it wasn't that hard actually to say these things. So how could you say these things in Catholic Ireland? But actually, as you imply, there was very much a kind of appetite for it. I mean, Ireland's always been a fantastic place to write, because people read and they respond, and there's a real sense of you still feel you're part of some kind of community. I'm sure you feel it as a novelist too. That there's a response out there. The one thing, and I deal with this in the book, the one thing I never, ever wrote about, I never said, and it's not a shameful thing at all, was that I was married in a registry office. Why didn't I say this? Because it's fine for me. I was writing for the Irish Times. I was fine. My wife taught in a Catholic school. And so right up to the time she retired, I couldn't say. By the way, I did a really interesting thing in the early 1980s when not very many people did it, which was got married in registry offices. It was a funny story, could have told her about it. No, couldn't say it because she could have been sacked. And the law of the land, a teacher was sacked for having a lifestyle not in keeping with the Catholic religion, a woman called Eileen Flynn. The courts, when she went to court, the original court judgment, the judge said, "You're really lucky you're not in an Islamic country, because a woman like you would be stoned." And this is in the 1980s. This is, so you had this kind of weird viciousness on the one side, and as you say, this kind of hunger of people. And in the middle, I think in the middle is the interesting stuff in a way, which is people who had found all these ways of getting around stuff. John McGahern, the great novelist, told me this thing about when he went to live in rural County Leitrim, he didn't go to Mass, and this was noticed, of course, and one of his neighbours said to him, "John, you're not going to Mass." And why not? And John said, "Well, I don't believe, and I feel I'd be a hypocrite." And the farmer said to him, "But you're John, none of us believes. We just go to see all the other hypocrites." And that was the sort of middle ground, in a way. And it's that middle which eventually decided to stop being quite so hypocritical, I think.
I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to deal with this question. I think it'll be the last thing I'll be able to pose to you, because it's an impossible question to answer. So good luck. How long do you think it will take for you a united Ireland? Do you think that Brexit has helped? I find this so funny. I don't know the ethnicity or the background of the person who's asked this question, but this is the thing that I get asked as a writer all the time. I'm sure it happens to you. How long, especially if it's an American person asking the question, as if it's an inevitability, which in and of itself is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I always used to say I didn't think I would see it in my lifetime. And probably as I get older and my lifetime gets shorter, I think, but I would not be surprised if it happens in my lifetime. I'm 64, so if I have a good span, if I get another 20 years, I think the movement is in that direction. It was already in that direction in a way demographically in Northern Ireland, and Brexit has, really changed everything. I wanted Northern Ireland and the whole thing to be just left lie for as long as possible. and 2 generations of boredom would have been really good for Northern Ireland, you know, just getting on with stuff, just living life, you know. And the Brexit stuff is just so horrible in the way that it's kind of raised all these existential questions again for people and forced them back into it. But there's still the doubleness.
Worst scenario, isn't it, really, for Northern Irish loyalists? What a grim scenario for
it's
them.
horrible. You know, if I was a unionist in Northern Ireland, I would be very, very depressed and angry about this thing because their own leadership, they supported Brexit. Can you imagine, you know, like just even thinking about your own self-interest as a group of people. Like, why would you do this? To cause all this trouble. But there's still the wonderful Irish doubleness about all this, you know, which is if you ask people in polls in the Republic, do you want a United Ireland? Yes, absolutely. You know, what would you do for United Ireland? Nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing. You know, you've qualified in any way, like would you pay more tax? No. But like even stuff like, would you change the national anthem? I mean, I don't know if you've ever heard our national anthem. Like, it's really terrible. You know, for a musical people, I don't know how we ended up with this awful din. I would change the national anthem. I would pay to change the national anthem, you know. But no, we wouldn't change the national anthem. Would you change the flag? No, like nothing. So once you start making it a reality, people say, oh well, you know, do I really want it? And so it's another one of those great examples of the sort of the rhetorical universe, you know, has one set of meanings and what really happens has another one. But what I'm very afraid of is that we won't have a choice. What I'm very afraid of is that, you know, the UK breaks up and in a way Irish unity is sort of forced at a pace where people are not ready for. And given the history of violence, given the potential for great difficulty. I just don't want to be the generation of Southern Irish people who take over the North. I want to see a process of, I don't want to see subtraction where 2 becomes 1. I want to see addition where the multiplicity of Irish identities, the pluralism, the possibilities of different voices, different ways of being Irish is kind of celebrated and given some kind of institutional form. So I wouldn't want, you know, to end my life as someone who's kind of imposing my culture on somebody else. I would love to see the possibility of this Irishness. The Irish Constitution is now wonderful. It says it is the aspiration of the Irish nation to unite in harmony and friendship all the people who share the territory of the island of Ireland in all the diversity of their identities and traditions. And it's a lovely definition of national aspiration, you know, isn't it? I mean, it really is, you know. But how do you do that? How do you represent diversity in a polity? That's the question we all face in the 21st century, isn't it? In a way, but I think Ireland has a decent chance of finding a way of doing it.
Hear, hear. Okay. I want to just thank Fenton for this incredible capacity he has to synthesize so much history, so much story, and to be present in the moment. And nonetheless, it's a wonderful book. You'll all find it in the bookshop, and there will be a signing. So please stay seated while I take Fenton to the signing table. But most importantly, I want to thank you for all showing up. Never underestimate the importance of readers for writers. Absolutely. Without the readers, nothing would be written. We need you. So thank you for showing up. And I hope that you enjoy this first day of what's bound to be a fabulous festival. Just to close on, in Fintan's words, he says that to accept the unknown without being so terrified of it, that you have to take refuge in the fabrication of absolute conviction. That's what we're trying to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.